All right, guys, welcome to our second master class. Have you seen we had a little flip in the schedule? Rain Pryor will be speaking next month, and she'll be focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today I am thrilled that we have Elana Wien. Elana will talk more about her journey and her work, but she is executive director of the Safety, Respect, Equity Network, more universally known as SRE. The reason I really wanted to have her speak is because I see this series as not only giving all of you leadership training and conversations about what it means, but really what are the things that you can do either now in your current roles or when you become CEOs or executive directors that create different workplaces, that build workplaces that are truly safe, respectful, and equitable for all. So again, I think this a conversation about Elana's work is vitally important and something that I hope that you all will follow up with her about and find ways of bringing into your workplaces. So we feel free. I know we have a chat going if somebody wants to drop questions in. If the chat is distracting, feel free to mute it. And of course, after Elana gives some opening remarks, we will open that up to conversation. So with that, Elana, I'm gonna turn it over.
Great. Thank you so much, Meredith. So again, my name is Elana Wien, and I'm the Executive Director for the SRE Network. Before I get started with the slides, just kind of given my sense of the group and what this course or series is about, I thought maybe I would just share for a couple minutes a little bit about my background and my own leadership journey. So I've been working as a Jewish communal professional for quite some time now, really worked my way up into senior management, primarily at one of the largest Jewish community foundations or the largest Jewish community foundation in Los Angeles. And so really worked my way up from senior program officer to director to vice president, and did a lot of learning along the way. A big reason why I decided in November 2019 to move into this role, it's pretty unusual for folks to actually leave a foundation gig, was I felt that these issues around gender in the workplace and in our Jewish communal spaces are critically important, and the pace of change was not happening fast enough. I felt that the change wasn't going to happen if we didn't continue to get some new energy, some new voices, some new folks in it. So that's why I made this big career shift in November 2019. And I'll share, over the course of the slides with you, a better sense of what SRE Network is about, the resources and supports that we provide, some of the cutting edge, not yet published research around the gender gap in Jewish spaces that Leading Edge is doing that we have helped to fund that hasn't yet been published, so get an insider's look. Would love for you all to also have a chance to kind of discuss with me and brainstorm some ideas around that research. But just wanted to put out there that I'm happy to be a resource to folks. I'm happy to share the slides after, as well as my contact information if folks are interested in connecting with me further, personally or professionally. So with that, let me share my screen. Okay, so this is kind of a quick overview of how I'm seeing this session going. I'll do some talking, we'll have a group discussion, then some Q&A, and then some closing. So SRE, we are a network of over 140 organizations, and we're rooted in a shared commitment to safety, respect, equity for all. We inspire meaningful change in workplaces and communal spaces by bringing people together to address gender-based harassment, discrimination, and inequity. We actually came out of the Me Too movement in 2018 when it went viral. There were Jewish women coming forward in workspaces, sharing their stories of abuse and harassment and discrimination. And there were a number of funders who came together to say, this is really an issue. We should do something about this. Let's pool our resources together and make some investments. That has since taken off into what's now the SRE network. And I'm super excited. We just celebrated our 3-year anniversary. Our focus is in community building, research and learning, strategic community investments using an intersectional lens of gender justice. This is something that is continuing to evolve in terms of what we mean by intersectional. So I always get excited to have the opportunity to talk about gender issues with groups that are focused on women and gender issues, and to talk about where we need to be approaching things from a more intersectional lens, especially in this current context. So these are all of our members, including JWI, who we're very proud to have a member. We have over 140 Jewish organizations, and you can see that it really runs the spectrum. We have camps, educational institutions, social service providers, social justice entities. So these are the over 140 organizations, Jewish organizations that have committed to implementing our standards around creating safe, respectful, equitable workplaces. We also, I had mentioned kind of how we started was these funders coming together. So with that, we've been able to do meaningful grant making in this space. So we've to date invested nearly $3 million in projects in Jewish spaces to advance gender justice, including JWI's Men as Allies, which we've been really excited to partner with them for a few years now. And so you can see some of the other kind of entities that are in this space. Again, a mix of folks that are doing more direct service versus larger Jewish organizations that are working on discrete projects to advance safety, respect, equity. A little bit about our standards, and there's more information that you can learn about on our website. This really came out of the idea of how do we help the Jewish community get really clear about what are some basic components of a roadmap that an organization can use on their journey towards creating safe, respectful, equitable workplaces for all. And so our standards have these 4 different buckets: leadership and accountability, policies and guidelines, reporting and response, education and training. And then we've developed a self-assessment that organizations need to take in order to become part of our network to help them understand what areas are stronger and what needs more work. So for example, the vast majority of our organizations have certain key policies in place around sexual harassment. The majority of them also say that they don't have, that the folks that are tasked with doing investigations around particular incidents within their organization don't currently have the appropriate training to do that. So there's different ways that we're able to use the assessment to assess where there's needs and how we might adjust our programming, our grant making, and other supports to help meet the needs, as well as how we can lift that up to the wider community where other folks can also come in to address them. A couple of key understandings that inform the way that we're now operating in the world. That is a bit of a shift for us. You know, coming out of the Me Too movement, it was very clear that we were focused on women in Jewish workplaces. Our standards really were drafted with that in mind. As we continue to evolve in our understanding of gender and the way that gender operates in the workplace and in the world, and that, you know, there is gender diversity. The world is not comprised of just folks who identify as women or folks who identify as men. Also, that organizations need a roadmap to create safe, respectful, equitable workplaces for all. And part of the problem in advancing gender issues has been how siloed they are. These are really 2 key understandings that are informing how we're moving forward. One being that the only way that we're going to achieve advancement in gender issues is if there is this holistic frame, and that gender issues by their very nature are intersectional. So they don't actually exist in a silo. We try and operate like they do, but they don't. So why is this important? I'm going to talk a little bit of sharing some Some difficult facts about the She session and things that you've probably been reading about the impact on women in the workplace. And a lot of those articles and research that is out there, reflects really what is currently being surveyed and assessed. And so there's going to be gaps there. So we know that any societal disruption hits hardest the folks living at the intersections of certain identities. We know, for example, that Black, low-wage working women who have children under the age of 10, for example, are affected in a very specific and more acute way than other folks. But there isn't necessarily the research and the facts there yet, or it doesn't get as much attention. So our understanding of what this actually looks like in our Jewish community is also impacted by the limitations of the existing body of knowledge that we have and research and how we think about ourselves. And so that's why it's important as we talk about gender in any space to really affirm that we are a multiracial, multi-ethnic Jewish community, and that we are a Jewish community that is cisgender, trans, and non-binary. So there are slides in here that talk about men and women and that kind of thing, and that is a reflection of how folks were surveyed versus our perception that our community is only kind of distinguished in that way. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the She session. Folks I'm sure a lot of you have been seeing these articles, and there's a need and a desire to really understand where the loss has been, where the impact has been, but also trying to foresee what those implications are longer term in the workforce, on our community, on our families. The two biggest areas are around job losses and dropping out of the workforce. So drops in workforce participation. So first, there's of course key sectors that are impacted by COVID that have predominantly female identified workforce. So healthcare workers, social assistance workers, which includes childcare, emergency services. So in 2020, American women lost more than 5 million jobs. A year ago, women outnumbered men in the workforce, and in December accounted for 100% of the jobs that were lost. So this is talking now about job loss. There's also a drop, which we've been all hearing about, in workforce participation. So what does that mean? That means folks, women primarily, who are dropping out of the workforce because they're not able to maintain their job while dealing with COVID, while dealing with childcare in a broken childcare system, which is a larger societal and historic issue. So there's 2.3 million women who have left the labor force since February 2020. The last time the labor force participation was rate was this low for women was 1988. So it's this 33-year gap that's happened in only 33 weeks. That's when we got to this point. So the other piece, there's folks who've been laid off. There's folks who have been who are no longer looking for work. And then there's trying to anticipate what may be coming down the pike, what we may start seeing as we're measuring information from late 2020 and early 2021, which is who are the folks that are considering downshifting their career. So are they going to be cutting hours? Are they going to shift to a lower level, lower wage role to make it more manageable to handle childcare and other responsibilities in the midst of COVID? So the key target area group that's most affected by this is working women with children under the age of 10. Any person who identifies as themselves in this category, I think, is not going to be surprised by the statistic, or who is a grandparent or friend of somebody in this demographic. This is across sectors. So this particular research is from McKinsey and lean in about corporate workplaces. So this is happening for lower wage workers, but this is also happening for C-suite. So for this series that you all are doing, as you think about what are some of the needs, but also the challenges of advancing in this area in terms of women's leadership, this piece is something that's really important to look at, this downshifting. And then there's who's considering dropping out altogether. So the prior stats were layoffs, folks who actually dropped out, folks who are thinking of downshifting. Then there's the folks who are thinking about dropping out of the workforce. And so that's where you see this really significant jump and gap between men and women with children under the age of 10. So the rate at which women with children under the age of 10 were considering leaving employment was 10 percentage points higher than for men with children under the age of 10. And, you know, as we know, when you actually do drop out of the workforce, the repercussions for yourself professionally and for your family in terms of lost wages, the challenges of re-entering the workforce at a later point, trying to make up that gap, the impact of that long-term on your retirement. Beyond that, then what your family may inherit, it has all of those ripple effects. That is just how everyone's feeling, which I'm sure seeing all of these slides is making most of this feel somewhere up here between burned out and exhausted. And so this slide really reflects that, you know, who is feeling the most pressure to work more, who's feeling the most burned out, who's feeling exhausted. And so based on this research, again, that was looking at corporate workplace employees, you have mothers here in comparison to fathers, senior level men versus senior level women, and Black men versus Black women. And I'm just going to mention, Meredith, if folks have things, I'm seeing the chat light up. If folks have things that you think it's good for me to pause to talk about, if you want to just let me know. And if not, I should have shared that before.
Yeah,
I challenged balancing the two.
Yeah, I think everyone was just kind of echoing some of the things that you're saying.
Okay.
Not a question yet, but just
yeah.
Wendy mentioned that dropping out isn't an option when it's a single income household. So just
exactly, yes,
there's pressure on single, especially when it's a woman.
Can I ask a question about that, Elana, with the research? Do you have research on specifically the impact on single income households or single parents in particular? Because for a lot of working women in this moment, even if they're able to, they don't have the option to drop out or to potentially even scale back if it means losing insurance.
Right. I don't in this presentation, but I love getting that question because that's something that I'm going to add in here.
Right.
Something that I have because I do believe that research is out there, and it would just be surfacing it here. I have seen research specifically looking at so not nonprofit or corporate workforce, but looking at the entrepreneurial field, where it is primarily women of color, primarily single income households. And coming back to the insurance piece that you're just raising, I mean, these are folks who are self-employed, and the impact there has been devastating. And so, yeah, the research is definitely there, which is a little bit different than this, which bringing that into this would help show in terms of levels of burnout, you know, exhaustion, et cetera, of folks who are trying to maintain the ability to have insurance and those other supports within a structure versus being solo entrepreneurs. And what I'll, you know, back onto that in the entrepreneurial space is you have to think of not just the impact on those women and their families if those ventures are folding, but then the impact on, you know, inventions in the community and new ways of doing things, the economic losses for the greater system as a whole, losing all of that creativity and small businesses. So this slide is looking at, you know, folks who are losing paid work due to unpaid caregiving responsibilities. And so this is where you see this distinction between women and men, and then also the racial and ethnic differences between with Latina women having the highest percentage, followed by Black women, followed by white. So comparing white women to white men, for example, you see a differential there. And this research is more focused on lower wage workers and was done with Time's Up and ELP, really making the case for why it's important for us to be investing in a larger care infrastructure, which is the bright spot, that we do have meaningful legislation, and there are opportunities in this current moment to finally invest in some of these areas. And so this research, and you can learn more here, is about what the impact of those kinds of investments are, not just on individuals, but the larger economy. So then to kind of, underscore, what does it mean for folks to leave the economy and what that larger impact is? We're not then just talking about, a year or two of COVID, or waiting until everyone's been vaccinated, or until there's certain, folks start getting checks to support them, the childcare kind of reimbursements. There's this longer term piece about trying to get a foothold back into the economy. So what does this look like in Jewish workplaces? So kind of switching gears for a moment, and then I'm going to come back to this gender gap. On the piece of, sexual harassment and discrimination in the workplace, there has been meaningful change in our Jewish workplaces that's been reflected by research that Leading Edge does each year through their employee kind of workplace assessment. So they administer this each year. They did not in 2020 for obvious reasons. But you can see in just these 3 years since SRE was starting to bubble up, and similar and complementary initiatives, that this movement here from how many of your employees, these are employee surveys, so they're directly reporting out their understanding of their own organization's policies. You could see this really meaningful movement going from, in 2017, there were 33 percent of employees who didn't know their own organization's sexual harassment policy, and that was decreased to 15. But then there's also this gap here between, that there's a sexual harassment policy, but do you know what to do if it's been violated? And you can see here that there was also this dramatic shift. So we're hoping in the survey that Leading Edge does this year, that we'll see that the work that we've been doing and our partners have been doing is continue to do a shift in this area. And then we can move into some of the other things I mentioned, which is identifying gaps around training for investigations, et cetera. And that's actually what this part here touches on. Okay, so coming back to the gender gap and what this looks like in Jewish spaces. And this is some slides now that I'll share with you from Leading Edge that my colleague Golly Cooks said, absolutely, this would be great to share with this group, because we would love to hear your feedback on some of this research. So according to their research, the Jewish nonprofit sector, 70% female identified, 30% male identified overall. But when you get into that CEO C-suite role, it flips, right? And so it's 70% of those top senior level roles are folks who are male identified, and only 30% are women. So there's this gap here. And an important thing in our thinking and in their thinking as we start working to shift this is that I would say historically a number of really important groups that have been focused around and initiatives around addressing this gap have had the lens of how to fix the women versus how to fix the system. And so it was all about, leadership program and training programs without an assessment of where there's actual structural inequity that's benefiting some folks and disadvantaging others, and is keeping these things entrenched, that no matter how much coaching and everything you do, you're still not going to be able to overcome them. Or only the few people can, but it's not going to be enough to create wider change. So we helped support some research that Leading Edge did in 2019. And the goal was really to map the gender gap. It was working with a ton of stakeholders over a period of time to try to lift up what are potential communal identified root causes of this gender gap, with the idea that if we could identify the root causes and we could focus on some key interventions that target those root causes, we may finally be able to make some really meaningful and tangible progress. So these are the 5 keystone root causes that they identified. Again, none of this has yet been published. We're sharing it with different stakeholders and getting their feedback. And so I'm excited to hear what you all think. 5 keystone root causes. 1 is around systems to diversify, so that boards, funders, and other constituents don't always hold Jewish organizations accountable to address diversity at their top leadership. That a meaningful number of Jewish organizations do not have a personnel strategy for DEIJ, that a meaningful number of search committees and boards hold race and gender-based biases about what makes a qualified leader. So these are kind of 3 root causes all around systems to diversify. Deprioritizing the problem. And so this is something that gets raised a lot of spaces, that men don't always speak out about the gender gap in top leadership. I think that there's different assessments of why that is, whether people are afraid to say the wrong thing or they don't feel obligated to intervene. So I think that that's an area that, you know, is continually being explored. And again, going back to JWI's Men as Allies program, you know, that's really the idea of that, of empowering men to be allies, to advocate for this work and helping them understand their critical role in doing that. And then discrimination, which actually leads back to all of those She Session articles that I was sharing and charts, that there's a perception, a persistent perception within Jewish communal spaces that you cannot be a top leader and a primary caregiver. And that's something that comes up time and time again. And so when we think about how that may be a barrier, not just for women that have kids, but also for men that are aspiring for those C-suite roles, but actually want, you know, if they're in an opposite sex relationship, want to have some kind of work-home balance and balance of child-rearing duties with their spouse.
Can I ask a question? Is that allowed?
Please. Yeah.
Okay, so on the previous slide, you're talking about the different systems to diversify. How, and you talked about being intersectional. How do you handle it when an organization does well on one axis but not another? Like, how do you encourage working in this intersectional way? Yeah.
So I love that question, and I will say that there is not an easy answer. I think that unfortunately the way that it's one thing to say that folks shouldn't work in silos and that they should approach things in an intersectional way because that's how the world is, that's how people are. But then there's the reality of how the DEI and DEIJ space evolved, and how gender, women's issues, women's leadership programs and investments evolved over time. And they really were, for the most part, developed a bit in silos. And so it's really just now, I think, that, and in the last year, that there is this moment of, wait a minute, we understand now, or at least there's more of a shared understanding that this needs to be approached in an intersectional way. But how is an organization supposed to create that culture if they're meeting on their own to identify different experts in different buckets and kind of put a plan together piecemeal? So that's actually part of our work as the SRE network, is how do we continue to be really focused on gender justice work, but how do we help those organizations when they reach out to us on how to approach this in a more intersectional way? And so something that we're developing, our first step is taking our standards and that were actually developed really with gender, predominantly women in mind. And we're currently refreshing them to give them a more intersectional lens. And we're going to be releasing that to our members and publicly in June. And it's going to have like an accompanying piece that kind of helps people understand where those adjustments and tweaks were, to hope that that's like a starting point as a bit of a roadmap. But there is a larger field challenge that's happening. So it's not, I would not say it's something that's like been figured out yet, and there's like a thing off the shelf that someone can just take off and just follow. So if you see organizations doing that, I do want to normalize that is an existing ongoing tension, and I'm having those conversations and questions every day with folks, and that we need to build out the vocabulary and the tools of how to do this. And the main distinction that I like to make about that is there's a difference between having an intersectional lens and taking a comprehensive approach. So an entity that is focused on gender issues, it makes sense for them, from my perspective, from a business perspective, that they continue to be focused on gender and they don't try to be the comprehensive entity that does it all. But how are they approaching gender from an intersectional way? So how are they talking about gender and talking about how gender is not, binary, and talk about how, women of color are uniquely impacted, right? So there's a distinction between a lens versus a comprehensive approach.
Elana, I just wanted to note that there are a lot of really interesting questions coming up. Would you prefer to finish up your presentation and then turn to it, or?
Well, so here's what I'm going to do. Let me show you just this next slide, and then I'm really open to the group and what folks would like to do next. So there was those keystone solutions, and I would love for us to have some time for me to share with you these like potential interventions and to hear from folks to what extent some of these are like resonating. You think that some of these are things that are like doable and could be, impactful, or like other ideas you have. I think we could also put a pause in that and first maybe answer some of these questions about the rest of the presentation and then do this. So
why don't we finish the presentation just in case you're going to address some of the questions, and then
okay,
the conversation.
Okay. Yeah. Oh no, I'm sorry. So this is the piece. So this would be the next step, is we would now discuss this. So I'm not sure if you want to.
Great. Review this slide and then we'll open it up.
Sorry. Got it. I'm with you. Okay, so these are some of the potential ideas around some keystone solutions. So for systems to diversify, acknowledging that boards, funders, other powerful stakeholders hold Jewish organizations accountable and incentivize them to elevate diverse leadership teams, right? So if you have this item here about how they don't hold them accountable, let's point out that they are actually in a perfect position to do this. They have a lot of power in that dynamic, and it makes sense for them to incentivize. The second piece is that Jewish nonprofit organizations implement personnel strategies to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in their workplace cultures. That's to address the fact that a lot of Jewish organizations don't have this. The third being that search committees and the boards that appoint them implement processes to directly work against explicit and implicit gender biases. So going back to the idea that search committees hold these biases, a potential intervention is to implement a process to, anti-bias training, et cetera. Potential intervention around deprioritizing the problem is to ensure that men are given the tools to speak out about the gender gap in leadership, as well as other issues around gender diversity more broadly. And around discrimination, which again is that idea that you can't have a senior level position and be, providing childcare in your family, that we actively shift our cultural assumptions about the capacity for an individual to be a primary caregiver and top leader at the time. And I think that this is something I will say that resonates with me, and that at the same time that we all have conversations about why did the following large federation hire a man again instead of a woman, I know from my own conversations with colleagues one-on-one, there are a lot of women and men who don't want those C-suite roles the way that they're currently structured, because they feel that it's outsized and outdated for somebody to be able to actually have, a work-life balance or semblance of that. So these are some potential interventions. And then these are, kind of the prompts I was sharing. It would be great for us to chat a little bit about, how the keystones land for you. Does it resonate? What are some of the ideas that may be worth testing out? That's my presentation, and I'm happy to do this first, or to take other questions first, and then we can do this, whatever.
There was some interesting, and I would, at this point, I remove the spotlight.
Great.
I would love to open it up to people to talk. There were two really, I think, to follow up on. One was a question about, you had a slide with the the bias is coming from the search firm. So those are more on that. And also really interesting point about, will what's happened under COVID kind of be the excuse to keep the status quo with more in CEO positions? So if you wanted to take those, and then everyone really just unmute yourself and ask questions. Let's make it feel like we're all around the table.
Yeah. So I would start with the second piece and say that when COVID hit in March of last year, I had just been in this role for about 4 months. I had spent the first 4 months as executive director doing a listening tour, creating a whole plan. COVID hit, and I was immediately getting calls from colleagues, primarily women, really engaged in this work, saying, I'm getting messaging from my leadership or from my peers, or I'm even finding myself questioning whether this is the time to continue to do this work, or whether we need to prioritize, like we're in a crisis right now, particularly certain aspects of the Jewish communal sector that were very severely impacted, JCC's camp, et cetera. We need to figure out if we're doing furloughs and layoffs, we have to think about the bottom line. This is not the time to do equity work. I also had colleagues who were amazing in that process who said to me, I'm really committed to doing this work, and I'm actually using what I've learned through SRE and the other work I've been doing to make sure that the way that I'm approaching these decisions around potential cuts, layoffs, et cetera, is using an equity lens. And so I really dug in at that time and still believe that, it is very possible to lose tremendous gains that you've made in a short period of time. That chart and that graphic of the 1988 and the labor participation is really stark. There's also an opportunity to really shift if folks really dig in and commit to it, and really hold ourselves and each other accountable. So I do think and then what I was going to say is then the wider conversation that happened in the country around racial justice and the racial reckoning was critically important, I would say, in really helping both the wider community cross sector, but also the Jewish community understand that we are now expected to have an understanding of racial equity and racial justice. We're now expected to understand what intersectionality means. We're now expected to understand that folks are being affected disproportionately by this crisis. And, but I do think that there's a question around who's expecting that and who has the power to ensure that meaningful change comes out of that. And so that's where I would come back to that slide that was looking at boards and funders, et cetera, is it's one thing for if you're a direct service, kind of the end user, or wider communal voices that are making the case. But if your funders and your board isn't really digging in and saying, we're going to prioritize this, it's not going to happen. And that continues to be a hurdle because those dynamics are so entrenched. And then I do think there was another question, but I'm forgetting what it was.
Can I ask a question?
Oh.
So with this sort of real emphasis on DEIJ, I'm wondering what some of those tactical shifts are going to look like so that it can feel more reflective of the broader needs that DEIJ encompasses. What's that going to look like for you?
Yeah. Can I ask just to clarify, is the question related to gender in conjunction with DEI, or just DEI starting to happen more in the Jewish community? Or
yeah, like I'm curious what it's going to look like to shift beyond such a gender focus to be more of everything that is engaged, like you said, the reckoning with racial justice and what that means. Like boards now need to look more representative in order for them to be able to support all of this.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of different pieces to it. I think that there is an awareness at the at the level of boards and funders of optics. I will say that representation matters, and that's been borne out in the research. And an entity that has not created the right supports or done the right work internally to be a supportive and positive environment for a more diverse board, staff, etc., it can create more harm than good. And so I will say that I know just in talking with colleagues that there is this tension between around pacing, how quickly to make shifts around personnel, programming, training processes. There's a tension around communications. So how much of that communication should be internal, external, and then coming back to the gender piece, again, the way that DEI developed, DEI really, in theory, encompasses gender, disability, orientation, etc. However, I do know just from when I came on board in this position, for the folks who knew what the SRE network was, SRE, when they referred to SRE, was gender in Jewish workplaces. And when they referred to DEI, DEI was racial equity in Jewish workplaces. I do think, going back to the prior question, there's still some need as a field for us to actually develop what the holistic view looks like, so that people really understand what that roadmap is. I think what kind of like changes you'll see and that we're starting to see, we are starting to see more diversity at the board level. We are starting to see more diverse staff. We are starting to see more investments supporting Jews of color, the great work that the Jews of Color Initiative has done to make grants to support Jews of color in different Jewish workplaces to advance DEI in those spaces. All of that has been really important. And there are a lot of organizations that are trying to do org assessments to understand where gaps are trying to bring in trainers and are struggling a bit in terms of figuring out the best path forward, figuring out pacing. And also the folks who are doing this training are, unexpectedly, there's been this influx of demand. So you also have a field that has a discrete number of providers in the DI space who are all incredible, who are also trying to figure out how to continue to evolve this field.
I did not mean to do that, but I'll ask a question. Sorry, I'm not sure what I just did, but I have a question around this idea around incentivizing boards. And would like to know more about that. And I really, everything you just said about what's going, it's almost exact reflection of what's going on in my own organization around leadership engagement and development and desiring a more diverse set of leaders around the table. And yet that process around making that shift is really hard, and we're doing it, but it's been very painful in some ways.
Yeah, and I'll share, the slide with the proposed interventions. So those are like ideas that that Leading Edge, my colleagues at Leading Edge developed as like a potential intervention. Like, what if we were able to incentivize boards to do this? So I don't actually have the answer. I think that would actually be really interesting for us to think about as a group and to hear kind of your ideas, like how might that happen? Like, what might that look like?
Hi. Okay. I had a quick question about equality versus equity when it comes to the gender gap. So I am really fortunate where I work for an organization where at every level, women and men either hold equal number of roles or women outpace men in terms of roles. Of course, like if you look at the individual contributor level, women have like we have like a 3-to-1 ratio of women to men. But when you get all the way up to executive leadership team, we're at a 1-to-1 ratio. I'm curious what an equitable workforce looks like when it comes to gender, because we do have this clear lean towards females until you get to like the higher ups, and then also where non-binary folks fall into all of this as well.
Yep. Yeah, so starting with the second piece, we recently updated on our website in our overview section, and I actually will share it with you because I think that it's in the chat, because I think that it's a useful example. We went through an internal staff process in terms of the understanding that gender continues to evolve and how we see our work in relation to it will evolve, but that it was important for us to be clear and transparent in terms of where our thinking currently is. And part of what we did there that was actually borrowed from the Women's Foundation of California, who I very much admire in terms of how they're continuing to think about this, is to be really explicit, like this is what we mean. And we know that language matters, and we want to hear from you about how we're talking about this and whether this is working or not working. Going back to something that I said earlier, there is the challenge around like the research and the existing surveys and also the issues around safety in the workplace. So not only do we have employees in our workplaces who are non-binary and trans and maybe out and open with that and ensuring that they are safe and respected and treated in an equitable way. But there's also the folks who are not comfortable being out in the workplace, and so they may be invisible. So that's why whenever possible, I'm really talking about gender, and mostly when I'm talking about women, I'm referring to like specific research that's referring to men and women. Going to the question about equality and equity, there's a lot of different definitions for these words and different frameworks for how to understand how they are interconnected. What I find helpful, or at least the kind of frame I use, is I think of equality as sameness, and I think of equity as fairness. And so a distinction between having something be the same versus having something be fair. And something can be both safe and fair at the same time, but something can also be fair and not the same, or vice versa. So I think if you're in a workplace where, and going back to fairness and why that's important, is if we're operating from a perspective that we are existing within an inequitable system, so there's already all these structures in place beyond us that are reinforcing the lack of fairness in our society, then it makes sense that we're going to have to adjust our interventions to ensure that it's fair for all. If we were actually operating within a system that did not have that baked in, then that would be different. So that's kind of how I think about it. So I think a question for you would be, or something to think about would be, what in your workplace, moving away from sameness, what in your workplace is seeming fair and what is not seeming fair, and what are some interventions to create the workspace where you really have that fair playing field?
Elana, I had a question. This is Shira. Hi.
Hey.
I wanted to bring salary into the conversation because I recognize that is a factor when we're talking about work-life balance, and especially working in nonprofit spaces, and especially even more working in Jewish nonprofit spaces, when there's this sort of idea that our work is altruistic and we donate, a significant portion of our time for lower salaries, and especially for women, and the gender pay gap. And so all these things conflating, making it harder for people working in this space to outsource childcare and have that, continue to grow in their careers and be the person they want to be at home. And I'm wondering what the conversations are around salary, not just about, closing the pay gap for women, but for the nonprofit or Jewish space in general, because it seems that we're comparing, we're trying to be equitable in our salaries and comparing between organizations, but there seems to be a systemic issue with how we how we put a price tag on the value of our work.
Sure.
Yeah, 100%. Oh,
if I could just jump in before Elana answers, there's a wonderful book, and I'll share it with everyone, Gender Equity by Design, that takes your point even a step further. That's the perception that you're willing to work for a lower salary in a way devalues you, and again, makes it less likely that you'll get one of those. I mean, how many top or our biggest organizational CEOs are coming from outside of the Jewish community? So it's almost like that pipeline of women's leadership is really stunted in a way because of salary. So Elana, I'm going to turn over to you, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a very complicated issue. I jumping to kind of some interventions, you know, one of our grantees is gender equity in hiring, and they've been very focused on salary transparency and salary bands. I definitely see a lot of benefit to that, and want to be very clearly supportive of it. And I also hear some of the challenges from hiring managers. And I know from my own experience, you know, once you put a salary band out there, folks who are applying for the job, if they believe in themselves and have been taught how to negotiate, will ask for the top number. And so there's a question of like, how are we really, what does the salary band actually mean? And how is an organization budgeting to ensure that they are paying equitably and the most they can, right, for the best work. But that we're all really like talking about the same thing and like understanding what we're negotiating around. So that's not exactly what you were raising, which I'll get to in a minute, but I do think it's important to point out that I think to address any of this, we need a toolkit. And so I think that the salary transparency and the bands is awesome. And one of the other things that I've identified as a need that I don't see happening is really transparent conversations within an organization across levels of, this is our organizational budget. This is how much we have to spend. This is what our fundraising looks like. Being transparent about what everyone is, making, or at least the buckets around personnel versus other expenses, and having senior leadership understand the importance of sharing the actual on the ground realities, because many times there's real inequity there where folks are getting paid in an over the top way that's not fair, and then other people are suffering. But other times there's real business needs that the organization has that we just don't have a culture of them sharing it with their employees. So being able to distinguish what is a sector-wide, like a nonprofit thing versus what's a Jewish communal space gendered norms thing versus some business pieces is really important. And to Meredith's point, the part about somebody coming in from outside into those roles, which is all too common, that goes back to the board committee piece, right? So this is reminding me of someone else's question about biases of search committees and search firms. It's not to say that search firms don't have biases, but what that slide was really referring to was when you have board members who comprise the search committee to hire the CEO role. If that board is coming from the private sector, it has this built-in respect, admiration, rapport for folks that fit a certain profile or have a certain background, that's then going to get baked into an inequitable search committee process. And then that's going to trickle down to the rest of the team that doesn't have that profile. So there's some really key power dynamics that really start above the C-suite role that really has to do with board and also funders that needs to be addressed.
Elana?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dahlia. I have a kind of one question, one tension that I'm feeling between really wanting to work from within an organization and also the realization that some things that will, and also the impact of actually exiting organizations and working from the outside and creating something new. And I feel that tension. It's something that I felt. I'm a congregational rabbi, And, so working from within and, so that's one of the tensions that I'm just currently feeling, like how do we balance that desire?
I love that you mentioned it, because I think, as I shared, I mean, that's been a professional question for me that I've been, exploring. And I definitely see the benefits and challenges of both. I think one of the benefits of being out, trying to work more outside of a system or outside of a specific workplace, is you are able, I think, to think a little bit more outside the box, because your sense of what is possible is can be, you have the room to think of what's possible beyond what you see as being your reality before you within a certain workplace. And so I found that when I've been working on doing change work within an organization, always being the person I am, always pushing the envelope, but that part of your mind that's like, will this really work? Or is this the right time? Or is this the shit I want to use? Is going to all be very much impacted by being within that structure. At the same time, like, there's so many incredible ways to do that from within. And there are a lot of folks in the Jewish community that I've seen really going back and forth between being like entrepreneurs, right? And like being kind of the innovators from within and without. There's actually Jewish leadership groups around this very topic. So you're definitely not, not alone. Yeah.
And just another question, and I feel like this might be the most popular comment to make right now, but where is also the responsibility as individuals? It's funny, actually the within part, I'm making that connection that I wasn't doing before, but like you just mentioned about negotiating and like really, so where is your organization's work with empowering the individuals to actually do that within work? Also the mindset work within them, but also not just within the organizations, but within the individuals.
Right. Yeah. So I think, super great question. I think that slide that I shared about, this isn't about fixing the people, it's about fixing the system, is a really important starting point. That doesn't mean that individuals don't have the opportunity for growth and gaining specific skills to help them be successful in their roles that they structurally may have not had access or been trained to do, right? It's just, I think it's a shift in an understanding of where the weight of that should move toward. So I want to answer that, and something else that I'm seeing in, or that I saw in the chat about the need for more male allies, which I totally agree and comes up in every room I'm in. 100%. And something that I felt was a kind of awakening or learning from me in seeing the broader conversation around racial justice in this country was we started all seeing, and I'm sure all of you started seeing it from your colleagues and your Facebook pages, this is about white people doing the work. White people need to do the work. This is not about people of color or Black people doing the work for you. You need to do the work. And there started to be these memes and different things of folks saying, tell us what you're doing for racial equity today. Tell us how you're learning to dismantle white supremacy within yourself. And all of a sudden there was this evolving sense of, and really demand, that white people show up for racial justice and racial equity and commit to doing their own learning. What might it look like if in this gendered space we had the same approach towards men? In a kind and open and engaging and supportive way. But instead of how are we trying to convince men to come to events or programming or read a particular article, shifting toward it's our expectation as women and non-binary folks that this is part of their learning and that they commit to this. So going back to the negotiation piece, we're not the entity doing that, but there's a lot of entities that we support, including gender equity and hiring. But I think part of it is also a light bulb moment. I was in a call yesterday and I had a similar question that had a little bit more of a sharper point on it. And someone said, well, and this was a woman leader saying, in my experience, as I've risen the ranks, it's very rare for me to find other women who really want that C-suite role and who have the HR, the financial acumen, et cetera, for that role. I find, this is this person speaking, I find that women tend to want the programmatic roles. And what I said was, part of this is also helping people understand the value and the skills they're already bringing to their work. Having been a grant maker, which is considered, and still grant maker, but my prior role, a programmatic role, I managed people, that's HR, right? I had to handle budgets and financials and grant reports, right? I had that financial acumen. And so there's definitely a place, to your point, of having, supporting us in that negotiating, not in some cases to learn new skills, but in a lot of cases to really just build our confidence in how to talk about our skills in a way that translates into those senior leadership roles.
Hi, I have a question. And maybe this is just my little pie space of the Jewish communal world, but how are you dealing right now with like the very loud Jewish Twittersphere pushback on the DEI thing? Like this has been a thing this week. Obviously, we're all here. We're wanting to learn this information we all value and think that this is important stuff to have within our organization. But like right now, there's a very loud, very male, very white pushback, from my perspective, pushback on this work and this idea of woke culture and the idea of DEI training. And like, what is it that you're doing to say, pish tosh, this is garbage. Why are you saying these things?
Okay, so I'm going to admit something that I know this is recorded, so it's probably going to come back to haunt me, given that I do gender work, but I am an aficionado of the Bachelor, Bachelorette franchise. I'm just going to admit it. And this whole thing with Chris Harrison has been fascinating to me. And if I put a pinpoint from my perspective on the biggest issue in that podcast that he did with Rachel Lindsay is, as he was talking about wokeness and what was okay in 2018 isn't in 2021 when we're woke, is this frame that what we're talking about now is a trend, and that it's like all trends, it's a passing trend. It's a thing of a moment and it's going to pass. And the other example he gave was, if I did this thing in 1970 and it wasn't racist, then it wasn't racist then, but we're saying it's racist now because we're woke, right? And so it's helping people understand it was actually racist in 1970. It's just the structures that were in place did not come down on you to tell you that that was wrong, or to create the environment where you wouldn't have done that racist behavior in the first place. And the same about this idea of like wokeness. It's not a trend. You have Black people and other people saying, we've been killed forever, and attacked by the police. We have this history of slavery. This is what happens when we try to get a bank loan. This is what happens when I try to secure a lease. And I'm fed up. And now we finally have enough white people saying, okay, I'm also fed up. So I think the important thing is how I approach it when I see it is, of course, there's going to be pushback when change is happening, but we can't deny that the change is happening. And there are some unique dynamics happening within the Jewish community around these issues that at the heart of them have to do with the relationship of Jewish people to whiteness. And there's something there that there's work that continues to need to be done. But I think we're past the point of being able to pretend and kid ourselves that the work doesn't have to be done. So that's my take on it.
Well, I want to respond to this, that part of what it's coming up in the chat, there's an added level of I see it as almost danger, because some of the things being written in the Jewish community are saying that this work is anti-Jewish in so many ways. That is dangerous. This work is Jewish in so many ways. And that is, I think, what has so many of our like hackles up is hit this as being against what we are all in this work to do is so challenging. And my hope is that it actually lands the community further on the side of needing to dive into this work.
Right. I think so. And I think it's critically important. And it's important for our existence, to be able to continue as a community, to be able to be real about who we are. And it's, absolutely, 100%.
I'm going to jump in with a question, Elana. My name is Margo Ettlinger. This is a brass tacks kind of question.
Yeah, I love
you're
this.
sitting in front of a board that's doing hiring, and you know that they're coming in with X, Y, and Z bias. Is there anything we can do as candidates? Any practical buzzwords, or, we represent, this group represents incredible talent, and we bring that to, the job market. But what can we say with all the bias?
Right. I think what's hard about answering that is, of course, I have in my mind the idea, the kind of what I would do. But I'm hesitant to do that only because I do feel that there is this opportunity now to really put more of our real selves forward. I know that, like, if you're going for that interview, you're not going to see who the other candidates are. And I know that it is very likely that there will be male candidates that have a certain profile and that they may get the job. But I also get contacted frequently by recruiters asking me to recommend women for C-suite roles and people of color for C-suite roles, and tell me the challenges they're having in filling those spots. There's a massive shift that's underway in our Jewish communal space for these C-suite roles. And I know that that's really part of what's informing this series. And so, yes, there's different things you can probably do to kind of like work the system a bit when you're in that room. But I think it's also important to come into that room or that virtual room with a confidence that they actually need me. Like, I'm literally the future of this organization, right? Like, if I'm a woman, if I'm a non-binary person, if I have young kids, if I'm a single parent, I'm actually the future of the Jewish organization, of the Jewish future of the Jewish community. I'm actually the future of this organization. This is actually what they're reading about and hearing about that they need. They're actually having a hard time filling this role. And I need to come in there like really confident and putting that forward. So that would be my advice.
Can we talk a little bit about expectations for these roles? I think I forget the category that it was kind of came into, but just in terms of, there's so much that goes into them, and there's a lot of people saying, I don't want to take that on because I don't want to set myself up for failure. I don't want to set myself up for burnout, whatever those reasons are, and how within our organizations and on the systemic level, we can work to change those expectations about what is required in the leadership roles and how they're structured to make it more conducive to somebody with, young kids or responsibilities outside of work, or who just doesn't want to be a workaholic.
Totally. Yeah, so I think that there's a few things there. So one is, I think it's helpful to know there's a group of Jewish women identified CEOs that meets on a pretty regular basis, that has been since last March. And this is now the point that we're all talking about this. What many colleagues are sharing, because many work for national organizations and many have kids, et cetera, like, I don't want to travel like I used to. It's great that people are getting vaccines and we may go back to work, but like, I can't have the kind of schedule that I had before. I want something different for myself. I want something different for my team. I need to figure out how to talk about that with my board and my various stakeholders. People talking about, should we write a letter? Should we do thought leadership around this topic? So just know that, like, that's the conversation that's happening for women, like in the C-suite right now in Jewish spaces. And I'm sure it's happening in the wider community of what are we going back to, if we're going back to something, which is definitely not going back to any kind of normal. And how do we want it to look different, and where may we have the agency and the influence and the ability to make some of those adjustments. So that's, like, I would think of as C-suite. I think when you're, which I know is really what this is about, I think when you're in the kind of middle manager or earlier professional, somewhere in early professional to like mid-manager level, the statistics are out there, and that's why there's this push to do these salary band transparency, is that, men will look at that job description and think that they can do 20% and like apply. And women and folks of color and folks of other identities will look at it and say, like, if I don't think I could do 100%, like, I'm not going to even go for it. And so there needs to be an understanding that a job description, of course, there's essential duties, but there's all these things above that that like no one human can do, right? And so understanding that, you know, we need to actually, like, you will probably have colleagues at your organization that are working and functioning at a different level, not with the same expectations of yourself that you have. And your employer isn't going to tell you not to work your tail off, but it doesn't mean that you need to be doing the work that way. Then there are the roles where folks are just not budging, and they're not going to budge unless they really, what I was just sharing with Margot, is what I see as the beginning of a trend. But the hardest, most entrenched things don't change until people are really like pushed to do it. And so I anticipate there will be a point where literally search firms and boards will not be able to find the candidate that they used to find to fill the role that they had outlined. And they are going to need to make adjustments, right? And it's not going to be just for women, it's going to be for all of us. And I don't know how long that change is going to take, but I feel really confident that it's going to happen. I guess we can stop right there. I don't know what if I'm saying, Meredith, what do you think?
I know, and I was trying to find, there was a comment that I wanted to, you know what, with all of this works, someone was saying, and I agree with it wholeheartedly, how do we change, you know, I was approached for that, the CEO of the Federation in LA, and of course I didn't want it, and I shared it broadly and said, let me know, and no one stepped up, and I get why you don't want those jobs because of the lifestyle. How do we change what the community expects of our leaders so that it does work, not only for those who identify as women, but those who identify as men also? Like, how do we make those positions more livable and more humane? And what do we do to say, all right, this, you don't have to be out every night in order to do this job well, or you don't have to be. I wonder if there's something around that. How do we change the pressures we put on our leaders to make them positions that we want?
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, I think it really does sit with the kind of funder board search committee realm for particular roles. And so that's why when I have the opportunity, I mean, I just share that feedback with search firms, or, you know, if I'm approached in a similar way, and, you know, I just say, like, by the way, you know, I'm a woman leader with young kids, and looking at this job description, this is not appealing to me. This just is not, but I think it's also going to take, it's going to take other folks pushing back. And I think the question of how do we influence boards and funders to make this change, it really sits with them. I think in theory, those roles that are very outward facing, that do lots of travel and lots of evening events, in theory, it's in service to the community. So in theory, there's a dynamic and an expectation there that's set with the community. And in that sense, I guess we could think of ourselves as collectively responsible if we were to expect our local Federation head to come to our gala and everyone else's gala, for example. But I think, right, I think most people would agree if we were told like that this role is being restructured so that like a human can do it without burning themselves out. I feel like people would get that the Federation head can't go to your gala. So I really do feel like the responsibility sits with the board and the search committee, and that funders can also play a role in really asking those kinds of questions, like, which candidates did you go to for this, and what was their response? Like, why was it that you weren't able to get different diverse candidates in that pool?
I know that Jenny has a question, but also Elana, Abby mentioned Third Plateau, who I know you work closely with, has kind of an innovative search process going on. I wonder if you're familiar with it, if you can speak to it. Is that something that, and Abby, please, if you wanted to unmute and talk about it more for your question.
Well, I'll just share briefly that, so prior to me being hired, so I was the first executive director for SRE Network when I came in November 2019. And so it really was advised by our funders. And then there were different consulting teams like running it. So it was first an entity called Jewish Jumpstart, then it was Third Plateau. And then when I came on board, we transitioned that contract. So I'm not sure if there's something that they're doing now that I would know I would be the right person to talk about, but I'm happy to hear the question and see if I can.
Sure. It's not so much a question, just as we're talking about ways to make the search process more equitable. In addition to all the work that's been going on about posting salaries, Third Plateau, for one of their Jewish impact positions, is asking that the application is, you take out your name and your email address and your address, and you just use your phone number, so that there's no name bias, there's no gender bias. And then in answering the questions, you are not allowed to use pronouns. Proper nouns. You're not allowed to say the name of the organization you worked for or the school you attended. It is just about the skills that you have learned in those organizations, which I think is a really interesting. I'm curious to see what sort of candidates it brings in when you're not comparing what university someone went to. It's how they took the experience they had. And I thought it was an interesting way to maybe take out some of that bias that we've been talking about.
Yeah, no, I love that. I wasn't aware of that, but that sounds awesome. Another thing that where gender equity in hiring has been helpful to me, and I've shared my job descriptions with them, is really kind of what I was commenting on before, identifying what's really essential versus nice to haves, and making sure that the job description is really about what's actually needed versus writing out this dream candidate who doesn't exist. And also, when possible, removing things about years of experience, certain educational requirements, to just where it's needed. And also refraining from asking for unpaid, work or product. And so, like something that we did, for example, for one of our search processes around communications, is we waited to ask for like samples until the final round, and made did a small gift to each of them for their time to create like a communications project, and like making sure that, because you do hear these horror stories, particularly in the communications realm, of folks like create a sample communications plan for my nonprofit. Okay, thanks so much. Now I have your plan, but I didn't pay you for it, and I'm not hiring you. And people seeing their ideas used by that potential employer. But I hadn't heard their plateau piece, and that's awesome.
Great. Jenny, I know you've had your hand up.
Yes. How do I lower it? So just a couple of thoughts. Someone said something about vulnerability and transparency from leaders. So a couple things that are kind of mulling around in my head. This is such minutia, but like for me, my supervisor is a woman, single, does not have children, but she puts in her calendar, and this was a change, and I would love to ask her as we're having this conversation why. But she puts in her calendar exercise. And like, there's just this piece about transparency that maybe in the past, if I had something to do that was in my personal life, I felt ashamed to have it on my calendar, I'd put out of office. Of course, you shouldn't put your private details on there, but like owning the fact that it is okay to take care of yourself. And I also wonder, back to Elana, what you were talking about, thought leadership, there are examples. I mean, my boss is a very good example, and I've noticed a shift in her, where she went from working in the office, 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. and she stopped doing that, and she prioritized herself, but she's never talked about it. She's never shared what happened. It's just an observation I have as someone who works closely with her. I would love to hear from male and female leaders in the Jewish community who can say, there are other models out there. We just don't hear about them. We're only hearing about the people who are burning out. And again, I say this sitting in a privilege and working for an organization that's super supportive. Like, I don't feel burnt out because I can ask my boss, and I just think there should be more stories about, like I put in the chat, I said to her, my kids are really struggling. I need to pick them up at 2 o'clock. I'm going to leave the office 2 days a week at 2 p.m. and be with my children. And she was like, her response to me was, is 2 days enough? Do you need more? And like, so anyways, I think the more we can get stories like that out there might help inspire others.
Yeah, I love that. And there are some really good stories that I'm hearing from the field, particularly in the light of COVID. So, entities that are doing more like mental health days or meeting free days, making sure that there's, a lot of like flexibility and transparency. I think so much of that comes from that senior leader and the culture and tone that they're setting. And so I've worked in various, workplaces and seen the whole, gambit in terms of how that affects the team. But what I love about that and what you're talking about, and that I've also seen works well, is that we know that we have this broken childcare system. We also have a broken mental health system, right? There's a lot of other pieces. It's really healthy and important as we're creating workplaces that are more flexible and understanding of our employees' needs, that it's their diverse needs, so it's including the childcare piece, but also understanding the mental piece and taking care of their well-being in a variety of ways, and really normalizing that that's like an expectation really of employees, that they're going to be able to have the room to take care of themselves and to model that. So yeah, 100%. And I did, what I will say is I just noticed somebody had mentioned how, the modeling is good, but many staff won't feel comfortable. 100%. And that action of, or what it looks like to invite an employee to do that, I've noticed is really needs to be tailored to the individual employee. So like blanket things, aside from like a blanket, like we're just going to close the office on Friday, but blanket, like, please use your vacation time. I want to encourage you to use your vacation time. That doesn't really do it, because when you think about it, taking care of yourself is also very personal. And so there's an interesting element there, which is that it's important for senior leaders to be encouraging their employees and modeling taking care of themselves, while not coming across as dictating that you as the senior leader think you know what they need. And that's something that I learned kind of earlier in my career, as I would see different colleagues that I thought maybe needed extra help or extra support. I would kind of jump in versus really first having the conversation of like, how can you best be supported? And so I think that that's a big piece. Like I know I both have had team members that want me to encourage them to take days off, and others that say, what I love about the time off is that I own it. It's my time. I don't want any senior leader encouraging me to take my time off. I'm going to do it when I'm good and ready. And then, of course, you put the COVID lens on it, which is that there is so much uncertainty and disruption. And some people may be afraid of the consequences if they take that time. Other people really need that structured time to help make their chaotic day-to-day bearable. So there's a lot of pieces there.
I think there are also little things you can do, and you could do it where you are right now to change the culture. Two things we talk about leaving loudly. So when men are like, hey, I gotta, leave the office at 4, it's my kid's softball game, everyone's like, what a wonderful dad. But when we do it, it's like, oh, she's not dedicated to her work or whatever. My staff knows that my family comes first, and that I support by setting that example, and by talking openly about my family. I encourage them to prioritize their personal lives. The other thing, I remember a younger staffer came to me freaking out one time because it was her first time. She wanted to host a Shabbat dinner, and she was having something like 20 people coming over, and it was Friday at 11, and she didn't think to start cooking the night before, and she was flipping out. She's like, Meredith, can I go? Is it okay? I'll take it as vacation day. And I was like, just go. You don't need to take it as vacation time. You've been working hard, just go. And that little thing of saying you don't need to have this as formal time off, and I understand, and like, oh my gosh, and next time let me help you with the recipes and planning. That created a culture where she knew that I was making sure that she as a person, as a human, mattered, and that there were other things outside of work that were important. It is 12:28 East Coast time. Elana, I want to thank you so much. You have stayed on far longer than I initially asked, even though you didn't realize it. But this was such an unbelievably robust conversation. We could continue talking for hours. I hope that this is something that everyone carries over to our Facebook group or other means. I will send everyone a link to join Zoom next week so that we can continue these conversations. Our next scheduled session is April 15th. That will be with Rain Pryor talking about DEI. So this was like the perfect track that we didn't even realize it just led from one conversation to another. So unfortunately, I do have to end things. I will also ask that we load up our chat into that portal where you can access the recordings. Again, only you all will have access to that. It's password protected, but this way you'll be able to go back and follow up on the chat if you mentioned everything, because it really was so robust. And yes, Elana, I will share, I will send out the slides to everyone. I know there were a couple statistics that I was making note of. And please, if you have not checked out the SRE network, do so. Elana, there was a conversation, a question about how to access the different offerings that you have. So I will share Elana's email so you can get in touch with her and her incredible team and learn more about the important work they're doing and making sure that your organization is a part of it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Meredith. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.